The sound of Latin prayers echoed through wooden barracks on a Sunday morning in 1944. Italian prisoners of war knelt in makeshift chapels across America. They sang hymns with voices cracking from emotion. This wasn't what anyone expected from a POW camp. These men had prepared for hunger, cold, and punishment. Instead, they found American chaplains welcoming them to Mass. They discovered freedom of religion behind barbed wire. Some couldn't believe it was real at first. Fascist propaganda had told them America was godless and corrupt. They expected their captors to mock their faith. Instead, Catholic priests conducted services in Italian. Guards allowed prisoners to attend local churches in nearby towns. For soldiers raised in villages where Sunday worship was as natural as breathing, this was extraordinary. But let's go back to how they got here. When Italy surrendered in September 1943, everything changed overnight. Tens of thousands of Italian soldiers found themselves captured by Allied forces. They were shipped across the Atlantic to a country they never expected to see. America was holding nearly 400,000 Italian prisoners by war's end. The journey itself was terrifying for most of them. They boarded massive troop transports under American guard. Many feared they were heading to years of misery or something worse. Fascist propaganda had painted dark pictures of what happened to captured soldiers. The first groups arrived in late 1943 after Mussolini's regime collapsed. They were unloaded at ports like Norfolk, Virginia, and New York City. Then came long train rides inland to camps across more than 40 states. The landscape amazed many of them. Rolling cornfields stretched to the horizon in the Midwest. Wide-open plains of Texas seemed endless. Forests of the Carolinas looked nothing like home in Italy. Some admitted in diaries that the train rides opened their eyes. America wasn't just skyscrapers and Hollywood-like in the movies. It was an enormous, varied land full of surprises. The camps themselves delivered the first real shock. Instead of dungeons, they found neat rows of wooden barracks. Mess halls served hot food 3 times a day. Recreation fields had soccer goals and basketball hoops. Libraries contained books in multiple languages. And then there were the chapels. Clean uniforms marked PW replaced their tattered battle dress. Medical checkups ensured everyone stayed healthy. The Geneva Conventions guaranteed decent treatment. But this went far beyond basic requirements. Many prisoners later admitted they ate better as POWs than as active soldiers in Mussolini's crumbling army. The guards weren't what they expected either. No constant beatings or threats materialized. Most American camp guards remained professional and distant, but not cruel. Some spoke Italian, or learned basic phrases to communicate. Over time, a rough rapport developed between captors and captives. Prisoners worked in non-combat roles as required by international law. Farm labor was common in agricultural states. Construction projects needed extra hands during wartime labor shortages. Logging operations in forested regions used Italian workers. They earned small wages for their efforts. These wages could be spent at camp canteens on cigarettes, toiletries, and candy. The idea that prisoners could earn money for personal comfort seemed unreal. Men raised in fascist military systems had never experienced such treatment. Work filled the days, but recreation filled the evenings. Soccer fields became centers of weekend excitement since Italians were passionate about the sport. Music ensembles formed naturally among men with talent. Painting clubs met regularly to create artwork. Theatrical performances entertained entire camps on special occasions. Educational classes taught English, mathematics, and mechanical skills. The Red Cross provided books and reading materials. Chaplains arranged for religious texts in Italian. This combination of discipline and freedom created unexpected normalcy. The physical layout reinforced this strange reality. Barbed wire and guard towers reminded everyone of their prisoner status. Yet inside the perimeter, barracks had heating and working showers. Beds came with clean blankets and pillows. Preserved diaries often note how accommodations compared favorably to their previous military barracks in Italy. The contrast struck them as almost absurd. The enemy's prison felt more humane than their own army's quarters. This realization began shifting perspectives in subtle but powerful ways. Beyond the wire, glimpses of American civilian life proved equally unsettling. Many camps sat near small towns where normal life continued. Families drove cars to work and school. Children played in yards without fear of bombing. Stores remained stocked with goods. This ordinary peace, unbroken by war, made prisoners reflect on their families back home. Italy endured constant bombing and severe shortages. Here in America, life seemed almost untouched by global conflict. The comparison was both comforting and painful. But amid all these surprises, one thing stood out above everything else. Every Sunday, camp life halted for worship. Soccer games paused. Work assignments stopped. Barracks grew quiet as men prepared for Mass. This wasn't just allowed, it was encouraged. American military authorities understood that religion was central to prisoner morale. Catholic priests, many Italian-American and fluent in the language, traveled to camps weekly. Some camps converted entire barracks into chapels. The first Sunday service was a revelation for most prisoners. After days of adjusting to American captivity, they suddenly found themselves invited to worship. Chaplains set up simple altars inside wooden buildings or under outdoor tents. A few candles, sometimes flowers from camp gardens, transformed ordinary spaces into something holy. For men raised in villages where church bells dictated daily rhythms, this felt extraordinary. They had prepared for spiritual isolation along with physical captivity. Instead, they could kneel, make the sign of the cross, and hear Mass in their own language. The services followed familiar structures that brought comfort. Hymns in Latin rose from voices heavy with emotion. Priests delivered sermons on universal themes like peace, forgiveness, and endurance. Politics were carefully avoided to maintain focus on faith. Then came communion, the most intimate ritual of all. Prisoners lined up to receive the host, just like in their village churches back home. For men who thought their souls might be forgotten behind wire, this sacrament felt like a lifeline to something larger than captivity. Special feast days became especially meaningful celebrations. Christmas Eve, 1943, saw prisoners at an Oklahoma camp decorating barracks with pine branches. Handmade ornaments hung from makeshift trees. The chaplain led midnight mass while men sang, "O come, all ye faithful." One diary entry captured the moment perfectly. We sang as if we were back in Naples. For one night, captivity was forgotten. These gatherings had a unifying effect that surprised everyone. Not every prisoner had been devout back in Italy. Some were lukewarm believers. Others remained skeptical of organized religion. But in captivity, faith took on new meaning and importance. Even men who rarely attended Mass at home found themselves joining the crowds. They came drawn not only by ritual, but by the sense of belonging it provided. The Mass wasn't just worship, it was identity. It reminded them they were Italians, men of faith, not just anonymous prisoners stamped with POW. American chaplains often marveled at the devotion they witnessed. They noted how seriously Italians prepared for services. Prisoners dressed neatly and even shined their boots before attending. Some volunteered to form choirs or help serve at the altar. Slowly, Sundays became the highlight, of each week. It was the one time when fences seemed to fade away. In their place grew connections to God, to memories of home, and to each other as fellow believers rather than fellow prisoners. The existence of these services represented more than religious tolerance. It was a quiet but powerful statement that even in war, America would not strip prisoners of their souls. For Italians expecting mockery or repression of their faith, this realization was deeply shocking. They discovered the opposite of everything fascist propaganda had taught them. Instead of a godless, materialistic nation, they found a country that took their spiritual needs seriously. This freedom of religion stood in stark contrast to what many had witnessed in wartime Europe. In Mussolini's Italy, the Catholic Church had a complicated relationship with the regime. Public worship existed, but often became entangled with politics. Priests who criticized fascism risked harassment. Many sermons subtly praised Mussolini as a protector of faith, rather than focusing purely on spiritual matters. In Nazi-occupied territories, conditions could be even worse. Religion was sometimes suppressed, censored, or twisted to serve propaganda purposes. Italian soldiers knew this reality firsthand from their service across Europe. They assumed that in enemy hands, they would be completely cut off from the sacraments. So when American chaplains welcomed them to Mass, it felt almost unreal. Imagine kneeling in a camp chapel, looking up at an American priest speaking fluent Italian. He blessed you, handed you communion, and asked nothing political in return. For men who had lost everything, freedom, rank, dignity, it restored something vital. Their basic humanity remained intact despite their prisoner status. Some POWs wrote letters home describing their amazement at such treatment. To them, it proved America fought with ideals, not just weapons. The shock deepened when they realized worship wasn't monitored for loyalty. No officers demanded that priests preach in favor of Roosevelt. No soldiers stood in back taking notes on who attended. The Mass was simply Mass, pure, unfiltered worship without political content. In an era when religion was often colored by politics, even in their homeland, this neutrality amazed the prisoners. They began sensing a deeper lesson in their experience. In the eyes of their captors, they were enemies. Yet, in the eyes of God, and under America's system, they remained men entitled to their faith. That message worked quietly but powerfully on their understanding. Instead of expected cruelty, they saw tolerance. Instead of mockery, they witnessed respect. This revelation rippled outward through their thinking about everything they'd been taught. Some Italian POWs, once deeply loyal to fascism, began rethinking their beliefs. If their enemy treated them with such dignity, what did that say about Mussolini's warnings? Could it be that the so-called godless Americans defended values closer to true Christian principles than fascism ever had? But the surprises didn't end at the camp gates. Something even more remarkable began happening in certain locations. Italian prisoners weren't just attending Mass inside barbed wire. Sometimes they worshipped in nearby American towns alongside civilian families. Local communities, many heavily Catholic themselves, extended invitations through chaplains. On Sundays, small groups of POWs escorted by guards marched through town streets. They entered parish churches, where they joined ordinary Americans for worship. For men told they were hated enemies, this seemed almost surreal. Take Camp Atterbury in Indiana as one example. Oral histories tell us Italian prisoners sometimes worshipped in local parishes. They sat in pews just feet away from American families. There was no hostility in these sacred spaces, rather curiosity and even warmth. American parishioners glanced at men in PW uniforms and whispered among themselves, But once Mass began, all eyes turned to the altar. In that moment, boundaries between prisoner and free man blurred completely. Both groups knelt together, prayed together, repeated the same words in unison. This shared faith sometimes blossomed into meaningful exchanges. After Mass, parishioners shook hands with the Italians. They offered rosaries or invited them for coffee and bread outside the church. Guards often allowed it, seeing no harm in brief human contact. Some Italian POWs remembered these moments as the most astonishing of their entire captivity. When supposed enemies treated them as brothers in Christ, rather than foreign soldiers, it challenged everything they thought they knew about America and Americans. The Red Cross and local Catholic organizations played important supporting roles. They donated prayer books in Italian, religious medals, and hymnals to the camps. Parish priests worked with camp chaplains to coordinate special feast day celebrations throughout the year. Easter and Christmas became especially powerful moments. Choirs combined POW voices with American parish voices in stirring performances. The symbolism was undeniable. In the darkest years of global conflict, faith built bridges across enemy lines. It wasn't always smooth sailing, of course. Some Americans distrusted the idea of allowing enemy soldiers into their churches. Families who had lost sons in Italy or North Africa sometimes resented generosity shown to POWs, but more often than not, shared Catholic identity outweighed bitterness. Italian prisoners were seen not as Mussolini's pawns, but as fellow believers caught up in a war none of them had personally chosen. This perspective made all the difference in how they were received. These encounters left deep impressions on the prisoners themselves. For men used to fascist slogans and wartime suspicion, stepping into churches filled with welcoming civilians was completely disarming. One former POW later said, "When I walked into that American church, I was no longer a prisoner. I was a man again." The memory of these shared masses followed many back to Italy. When they told families about America, they didn't just describe food or barracks life. They told of kindness from strangers, of praying beside the enemy, of discovering faith unbroken by politics or hatred. In those recollections, seeds of post-war friendship between Italy and America quietly took root. Even masses inside the camps revealed interesting cultural differences between Italian and American Catholic traditions. The foundation remained the same: Latin prayers, familiar hymns, unchanged structure. But style, atmosphere, and even music often felt different to Italian sensibilities. Prisoners raised in small village parishes expected churches echoing with centuries-old chants. They were used to incense hanging heavy in the air and ornate marble altars. In places like Texas or Nebraska, camp chapels were often simple wooden halls with tables draped in white cloth instead of elaborate fixtures. To Americans, this simplicity was practical and appropriate. To Italians, it initially felt jarring and somehow incomplete. One diary recalled, "It was Mass, yes, but without the soul of our churches at home." Yet despite disappointment with physical surroundings, the essence of ritual remained intact. Music provided another point of cultural difference to navigate. Italian Catholics were accustomed to expressive hymns, often with choirs that filled village squares on feast days. American masses leaned toward straightforward hymns, sometimes with organ accompaniment or no music at all. POWs often stepped in to form choirs themselves, filling gaps with familiar songs from home. Some camps encouraged this, providing sheet music and practice time for rehearsals. The result was an odd but beautiful blend of traditions. Latin liturgy conducted by American chaplains was accented by Italian voices singing with unmistakable passion. Guards sometimes watched these performances with curiosity and even admiration. Customs also revealed contrasts between the two Catholic cultures. In Italy, religious festivals were celebrated with public processions, church bells, and elaborate displays. In camps, such outward expressions were necessarily limited by circumstances. A few chaplains allowed small processions within the barbed wire perimeter. Prisoners carried handmade statues or icons around the compound in solemn ceremonies. Guards watched these pageants with amusement, often unsure what to make of the elaborate rituals. But to the Italians, these moments brought precious slices of home into captivity. Confession revealed additional cultural adjustments that had to be made. Many Italians were used to confessing to priests who knew their families, villages, and personal histories intimately. In America, confessions were often given to chaplains who were complete strangers. Some prisoners hesitated at first, worried they couldn't open up to foreign priests with heavy accents. But over time, they adapted to the new reality and found unexpected benefits. The distance sometimes made confession easier rather than harder. They could speak freely and unburden themselves without fear of gossip traveling back to their home communities. Anonymity provided its own form of spiritual comfort. Even small gestures carried significant weight in these circumstances. Italian prisoners were astonished to see American chaplains treating them with equal dignity to U.S. soldiers. Sacraments were distributed without distinction between groups. There was no separate line for prisoners and no withholding of communion. To men expecting to be degraded and humiliated, this equality felt profoundly moving. It restored their sense of basic human worth despite their prisoner status. Not every prisoner embraced the experience with equal enthusiasm, of course. Some remained distant, unsettled by differences from their familiar traditions. A handful muttered that these were American masses, lacking the warmth and authenticity of home. Yet the majority adapted successfully to their new circumstances. They found comfort in the common ground of shared faith, despite stylistic differences. The culture clash didn't erase the ritual. It enriched it with new perspectives. In adapting to a new way of worship, prisoners discovered something unexpected. Catholicism, though expressed differently in America, still bound them to the same universal church. What united them with their captors ran deeper than surface differences. That realization grew stronger in the days following Mass. When the last hymn faded and priests gave their final blessings, Mass didn't simply end for Italian prisoners. The hours afterward often became the most human part of their entire week. Faith had opened doors through which flowed gestures of kindness. These small acts softened the harsh outlines of captivity in ways that surprised everyone involved. Inside the camps, it began with simple but meaningful exchanges between people. After Mass, American chaplains sometimes lingered to chat with prisoners. They practiced their Italian language skills or encouraged POWs to ask questions about American customs. Guards, usually distant and professional, occasionally shared cigarettes or candy. Fellow prisoners passed around bread saved from their rations. They exchanged small tokens, like hand-carved rosaries made in camp workshops. The atmosphere grew calmer and warmer, as though collective worship had momentarily erased boundaries. Outside the camps, effects were even stronger and more lasting. In towns where POWs attended local churches, parishioners often stayed afterward to speak with them directly. Mothers pressed homemade baked goods into their hands. Children offered handshakes or stared with wide-eyed curiosity. Priests sometimes invited prisoners to join parish meals while still under guard supervision. The Italians tasted something rare in these moments: genuine community acceptance. They were no longer anonymous enemies, but men with names, stories, and families waiting back home. Some friendships took root in these brief encounters. Prisoners began exchanging letters with American parish families. Communications were carefully censored by authorities, but remained deeply meaningful to both sides. These pen-pal relationships sometimes endured long after the war ended completely. A few former POWs even returned to America years later to visit families they had first met through church connections. In interviews decades afterward, many remembered these bonds more vividly than work details or food. The rituals of shared humanity extended to holiday celebrations as well. On Christmas, towns near camps often organized gift drives specifically for POWs. Packages of warm clothes, prayer books, and homemade sweets made their way into the hands of men expecting only deprivation. One Italian prisoner recalled his astonishment at receiving a knitted scarf. It came from an American family he had never met personally. In that moment, he wrote years later, the war disappeared. There was only kindness between human beings. Faith also offered opportunities for forgiveness, though quietly and gradually. Some prisoners wrestled with guilt over fighting for Mussolini's regime. Others struggled with bitterness over being captured and separated from their families. Yet when they knelt beside Americans at the same altar, those heavy emotions began to shift. Shared prayer reminded them that their captors weren't monsters, but fellow believers trying to live decent lives. One former POW described it as, "The first time I saw the enemy as human." Of course, not every interaction led to lasting friendship. Some Americans remained openly hostile, unwilling to see past the enemy uniforms. Some prisoners clung to suspicion, convinced that generosity was an elaborate trick. But enough bridges were built that overall memories of captivity were colored not just by fences and forced labor. They were shaped by moments of genuine humanity that transcended the circumstances of war. The most powerful part of this legacy was its remarkable endurance over time. Long after the war ended completely in 1945, the impact continued. When ships began carrying Italian prisoners back across the Atlantic, many left America with something more than memories of barracks and work details. What stayed with them most vividly was the rhythm of Sundays. They remembered the sound of hymns rising in wooden chapels. They recalled the sight of priests lifting the communion host. They treasured memories of strangers who welcomed them into parish churches. In letters and memoirs written years later, they often described these moments as turning points. For soldiers who had once sworn loyalty to Mussolini, the experience of worshiping freely behind barbed wire left lasting impressions that shaped their entire worldview. They realized the enemy they had been taught to hate was actually a country where dignity was preserved even for prisoners. That realization softened hearts and fundamentally reshaped minds about America and Americans. Many returned home convinced that America was powerful not just militarily, but in its ideals and values. This legacy influenced relationships between the two countries long after hostilities ended. When Italy officially switched sides in 1943, joining the Allies against Germany, foundations for friendship had already begun forming in POW camps across America. But personal experiences of prisoners gave that alliance deeper emotional meaning. They carried home stories of kindness, religious freedom, and discovering that their faith was not only tolerated but actively supported by their former enemies. These stories spread through villages and towns across post-war Italy. They created new understanding of America among ordinary people who had never traveled abroad. Historians note that many former prisoners became bridges between the two nations in practical ways. Some used English learned in camp schools to work with American businesses. Others maintained pen-pal friendships with American families, exchanging photos of children and grandchildren for decades. A few even returned to the United States permanently. They were drawn back by connections first formed during Sunday Mass in captivity. The legacy also became part of broader Catholic history and understanding. The sight of enemy soldiers worshiping freely in America during wartime became part of larger narratives about religious liberty. It stood in sharp contrast to repression and manipulation of religion in fascist and Nazi Europe. For the Catholic Church, it served as a reminder that faith could flourish in the most unlikely places, even POW camps surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers. Decades later, oral histories collected from former Italian POWs still circle back to those transformative Sundays. They remembered soccer games, food quality, and work in agricultural fields. But above all else, they remembered kneeling in prayer and feeling fully human again despite their circumstances. One veteran summed up the entire experience with elegant simplicity. "I expected chains. Instead, I found God waiting for me in America." The story of Italian prisoners attending Catholic Mass every Sunday represents more than a wartime anecdote or historical curiosity. It stands as proof that even in ages defined by brutality and hatred, basic humanity can endure and flourish. Barbed wire could not cage the human spirit or genuine faith. Labels of enemy could not erase the power of shared belief and common worship. In the quiet rituals of Sunday Mass, men from opposing sides discovered something profound. What bound them together as fellow believers was far stronger than the war that had torn their world apart. That discovery changed lives, shaped post-war relationships, and created lasting legacies of friendship between former enemies who found each other in the most unlikely place, behind the wire of American POW camps, where faith, not fear, ultimately prevailed.